On June 27, 1969, inside the massive, tiered concrete of Mexico City's Azteca Stadium, El Salvador's national team scored in the 11th minute of extra time to secure their path to the World Cup. But as the roar of the crowd echoed through the stands, it was quickly drowned out by the heavy drone of World War II-era fighter planes banking out of the clouds to drop high-explosive bombs. The soccer victory triggered a multi-front military invasion that left thousands of civilians dead in the dirt. History remembers this as the Football War, a 100-hour slaughter supposedly fought between El Salvador and Honduras over a game of soccer. But nations do not mobilize armies over a scoreboard. The narrative of a sports rivalry gone wrong was a lie, carefully engineered by two failing governments. To understand why 3,000 people died in the summer of 1969, we have to look away from the pitch and examine the political crisis they were trying to hide. Looking at this aerial view of El Salvador, a geographical trap is clear. In the 1960s, it was the most densely populated country in the Americas, with almost all the arable land hoarded by a powerful oligarchy known as the 14 Families. Squeezed out of their own country, 300,000 desperate Salvadoran peasants walked across the border into much larger, sparsely populated Honduras, looking for open farmland and work. They found a brief reprieve until 1962, when Honduras passed a sweeping land reform law. Instead of taking acreage from wealthy American fruit companies, the Honduran government began violently evicting Salvadoran migrants to redistribute their farms to native citizens. Entire families were marched back to the border by the military. Migrant neighborhoods were targeted by vigilante groups, pushing regional tensions to a breaking point. By 1969, the Salvadoran oligarchy was dealing with an unmanageable refugee crisis, and the Honduran government was facing its own furious peasant class. Both regimes desperately needed an external enemy to stay in power. That enemy arrived in the form of the 1970 World Cup qualifiers. These Salvadoran athletes, posing here for their team portrait, were about to be turned into unwitting pawns for state-sponsored propaganda. When the Salvadoran team traveled to the Honduran capital for the first match, organized mobs surrounded their hotel, smashing windows and beating drums all night. A week later in San Salvador, Honduran players faced the exact same treatment, eventually fleeing the stadium in armored vans. The governments seized the moment. When an 18-year-old Salvadoran fan took her own life after the first loss, her funeral was broadcast live on national television to stoke patriotic rage. They hoisted a filthy rag up the flagpole instead of the actual Honduran colors. These stadium brawls channeled years of state-sanctioned xenophobia and economic resentment into physical violence. The matches provided a convenient, manufactured excuse. Under the cover of national pride, El Salvador severed all diplomatic ties and quietly mobilized its armed forces. On July 14, 1969, the Salvadoran military launched a full-scale invasion into Honduran territory. Passenger planes had bombs strapped to their cargo holds to strike the Honduran capital, while refurbished World War II Corsairs and Mustangs engaged in piston-engine dogfights nearly 3 decades later. On the ground, Salvadoran infantry and light armor rapidly poured across the border. As seen here, the combat spilled into the streets, leaving soldiers to carry bloodied casualties through urban neighborhoods. Deploying a coordinated, multi-front assault, complete with air raids and tank battalions, requires months of logistical planning. It is a calculated, strategic land grab, not an emotional reaction to a soccer score. Gathered around this table, the Organization of American States forced an emergency session threatening heavy economic sanctions until El Salvador agreed to a ceasefire just 100 hours later. But those 4 days left a catastrophic toll. Up to 6,000 people were dead, and the remaining 300,000 Salvadorans living in Honduras were violently, permanently expelled. As for the soccer, El Salvador did travel to Mexico for the 1970 World Cup. They lost every single match and failed to score a single goal. All the bloodshed achieved absolutely nothing on the pitch. And despite these staged photo ops of officials holding hands, the underlying border disputes and land scarcity remained completely unresolved. 300,000 dispossessed refugees returned to a tiny Salvadoran homeland, where the 14 families still refused to yield a single acre of their plantations. That sudden, massive influx of desperate people with no jobs and no land created an unbearable socioeconomic pressure cooker. With the economic disparity left to rot, the pressure exploded 10 years later into the Salvadoran Civil War, a brutal conflict that would leave over 70,000 people dead. The soccer war proves that sports do not start wars, but when a game is hijacked by corrupt regimes looking to hide their own failures, the beautiful game can easily be the match that lights a waiting powder keg.